Good afternoon, Roscoe. Thank you so much for joining me today. For all of you who are watching, this is Roscoe Fernandes. He's an independent employment lawyer from Centurion Legal. And today we're going to talk about the importance of valuing your staff when making redundancies. Because this is an area, isn't it, Roscoe, that you specialise in. Employment law, it's something that is your day-to-day work, which I'm presuming is very much more busy at the moment due to COVID and furlough and staff being made redundant as furlough comes to an end. Can you sort of explain a little bit more for those who are watching?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. I'm an employment lawyer by background, 16 years qualified, got my own business, Centurion Legal, which has been going for about 7 years now, coming up for 8 in fact. I act about 95% of the time for employers and do a little bit of employee work, but mainly advising on settlement agreements. At the moment, as you quite rightly identify, employment law is very busy because of what's going on with COVID-19. Everybody is probably tired of hearing about COVID right now, but it's very prominent, sadly, because of its effects on employment as a whole. And we're seeing an increase in the number of redundancies taking place, sadly, because businesses are being affected by being shut in effect and having to gear back up to reopen, and it's hit profits despite the fact that there are all these loans and grants out there. Some employers have not done particularly well out of it, so I'm seeing a lot more in terms of redundancy. I mean, typically I wouldn't handle as many redundancies because I act on non-contentious matters, say drafting policies and procedures, day-to-day advice on disciplinary and grievances, and then business takeover, TUPE, and then the defence of Employment Tribunal claims. But at the moment, redundancy sadly is the buzzword. So I think you quite rightly identify redundancy and treating your staff fairly is very important, because any employer faces that situation has to make reasoned judgment. And I think the key thing for employers to remember is the role and not the person who is being made redundant. So you need to assess what you have in terms of client demand, and then decide what you need resource-wise in terms of taking your business forward. I think when you've got a number of people doing the same sort of role, whether it be exactly the same role or a substantial overlap, what you've got to consider is whether or not you pool roles together. Say, for example, you have sales executives and you've got more than one of those, so you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, put them all together, and then you conduct a fair scoring system based upon objective criteria to see who scores the most high and who scores the lowest. And typically what you will do, put them all into a matrix and then decide how many redundancies need to be made in terms of headcount to reduce by, and then score, and then look at that at the bottom to find out who's come out and consult with them. So it's important that you pick objective selection criteria and score fairly.
Because it must be very hard for the employers as well, because as you've rightly sort of pointed out, it has impacted businesses, and particularly sort of SME businesses that haven't necessarily been assisted as much as other organisations throughout the whole process, whereby they are having to reassess. I mean, I tend to like to look at things from a positive stance, and obviously it's an opportunity to look at things and refine things and reorganise. But that whole point of you have got to make redundancies, obviously it is impacting on you. You run the business, you've got to make these decisions. You might not be feeling particularly great about it. You've got to let the staff go, but it's important not to let that transfer onto the staff by your ranks being, as I say, transferred over. And it's thinking about how they are going to feel, because ultimately, as you then start to rebuild your business, valuing your staff and how you go through that redundancy process fairly, as you've pointed out with, if you've got 3 members of staff doing the same job, it's the job, not the person. You do that matrix and you make an informed decision as to who you let go. But it's being mindful to those people, because although that you're looking at the job, not the person, you've actually got to look at the person, not the job, in terms of how that person's got emotions. The job doesn't have emotions. And it's leaving that person with they understand the reasons you've had to make that decision, and how you treat them and treat them fairly in making the decision and making them redundant because their job's redundant. that then helps your business moving forward as you then start to rebuild. Because if they go away with a bitter taste in their mouth, that isn't going to help your reputation moving forward. And, you know, through my time in recruitment, the stories that I've heard from people, and one very, very recently working for a large organisation that was going through a consultation process, and I'd had a job offer for him, and they wouldn't listen to him. He had no one to go and talk to, even though he was going through this process, and lost out on the job offer because he couldn't negotiate this sort of start date, because they were saying, well, no, you've got to stay until the end. And yet they were making him redundant, his job redundant, in the middle of a pandemic. And you just think, well, hang on a minute, do have a little bit of compassion as well, because now, rather than him leaving with a good recommendation about the business, it's being tainted after, you know, about 6-7 years of service with being actually not feeling valued. So where do you stand on that?
Yeah, no, I totally get that. I think communication is always key in the process. So if we go back to the pool situation where you've got, say, 3 people in the same role, I think what you should do as an employer is come up with the criteria that you're going to score them on, and then talk to them about it. Seek feedback in terms of what you're actually going to do criteria-wise. You pick objective things like, for example, a disciplinary record, appraisals. Look at things like that, timekeeping, if it's not tainted by anything else. Those are the key things that you should be looking at, and discount anything which could be discriminatory. Say, for example, sickness record. I mean, if you're going to use that, then you need to discount any disability-related absence. But if you talk to people about what it is you're intending to do, at least they feel valued and able to input into the process. And then anything which comes out of that, they're able to understand a bit better, because being selected, or the role being selected for redundancy, is never an easy thing to stomach. At least if you understand the rationale for your selection or the role selection, you can then have a two-way conversation, meaningful dialogue as to why it's been selected and whether or not there's any ways to avoid redundancy, such as alternative roles within the business. And if there's not, then you can talk about the way forward, including whether or not you're going to have to wait a notice period, or whether or not you can be released, for example. You might be released for payment in lieu of notice, which makes it more easy then to go and look for a new role, because you're then free to do that. And like you say, in terms of that candidate that you had, I mean, it's not going to be easy for them, because they've had a job offer. Understandably, they're going to want to go to it. If the role that they do within the business at that time is going to be made redundant, it's best for them to try and negotiate to get out quickly and to have that discussion with the company.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And that's what I was fascinated that they weren't facilitating that, if you like, you know, because it just seemed so short-sighted. You know, there he was being made redundant, and he knew he was being made redundant. He was through the redundancy consultation, but there didn't even seem to be anybody, a point of contact he could go to in the interim to speak to actually investigate any further. So, you know, I mean, that was one case, but I mean, it is about that value. And I think there was something that you mentioned there as well, which I thought was really rather important to highlight, was the other opportunities that could arise within the business. Because if you've got somebody who's been working for you, even though the role's been made redundant, looking at their skill set, you know, their knowledge and understanding of the business, it could be so much more, it could be valuable elsewhere within the business, even if it might not be the role that they've been doing. You know, it's about having that conversation with that person, as you say, the communication, because people can sometimes end up in jobs but actually be even more suited to something else, and that's what redundancy can bring about, that opportunity for reflection and examination, and where that skill set can be utilised within the business that actually might enhance it even further. You know, there's always different ways of looking at things. So, you know, generally in your experience, you know, certainly at the moment, are companies making volumes of redundancies, or does it tend to be a handful, and are they generally sort of valuing their staff, or, you know, what would you suggest right now in terms of how it feels market wise?
I think it's relatively steady. I think that quite a few businesses are waiting to see what comes towards the end. But what I'm saying to them is obviously you've got the CJRS, the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme in place, and employees may be furloughed. But what you need to do is to evaluate the business and see how you're going to be fit for purpose. So don't leave it too long if you need to make changes. So in terms of taking it forward, I mean, people that I've been working with, I've told them, be proactive about it, get yourselves ready now, talk to people. I mean, there may be ways to avoid redundancies, like shorter working hours, for example. And when we talk about redundancies, most people are familiar with compulsory redundancies, whereby the business has to do it. But think about inviting volunteers for redundancy as well. And a lot of the time, when you're looking at redundancy situations, if you come into it later on as an employment lawyer, you may find that people you've not worked with before haven't been that clear with the consultation process in terms of what it means, the opportunities out there, if any, and supporting the employee throughout the process, which is important, because if you do that right, both parties will go away, hopefully as amicably as possible. So I think that's really important in terms of the way that they conduct themselves as a business, because like suitable alternative employment, I mentioned it earlier, it is important to consider. A lot of unfair dismissals will turn on that point alone, whether the employer considered whether there are vacancies within the business for that employee. Particularly with smaller businesses, they tend to understand the skill set, but with the larger businesses, they may not necessarily be aware of the skills base that the employee has in terms of areas, because they might have been recruited to one role, but have experience in other areas that that business could utilize. And it's important. It really is.
Absolutely. And they're missing a trick if they're not looking at those people, because they may then find themselves recruiting in another area, which is going to be a cost to the business in terms of the staffing, the time, and if they're using a recruitment agency like myself, there's a fees involved, whereas actually they might have somebody within that's absolutely spot on and perfect for it. So it is, I would encourage people to do that, or employers to do that, time and time again. And just to come back to what you're mentioning about the furlough, which is something that I've become, in conversations I've had more recently, clearly this last year, in relation to furlough, that the longer people are off on furlough, it's taking them away from that sort of day-to-day activity of being in the workplace. And I mean, I'm thinking of a conversation I had with somebody only a few months ago now, and I think it was a payroll position that they'd been for, and they'd been for an interview, and they put the company that were actually recruiting said, well, your payroll skills aren't as up to date as they ought to be. But she'd been on furlough. It's all, hello, I can still do the job just because I've not been doing it. But there's that misconception with the people that potentially are recruiting for roles, with people that have been on furlough for a long period of time, but they've been out of the rhythm of the workplace. And like you're saying, if there's an opportunity to do reduced hours, get them back in on reduced hours, or perhaps make that decision on sort of redundancy sooner rather than later to allow people to go back into the workplace. I mean, I only had a conversation less than a week ago with somebody that had been made redundant from a role with the Topshop group, Top Man, and he'd been on furlough and been just waiting and waiting and waiting. He'd been with the company, I think, about 6 years, and they'd been through 3 restructures and was on furlough and was hanging on to the bitter. And then suddenly it was like, without notice, oh, you've all been made redundant. Whereas all that time, had there been more communication or perhaps more decisions made sooner, he could have started to look for a new job sooner, rather than they just then axed all the staff, because obviously the business went under. I mean, I know you can't always foresee that, but maybe, where staff are being held on to, because of the furlough process, in some respects, yes, I understand it, and it's useful, and I'm not denouncing it. It might not be actually very helpful in helping people move forward. It's a difficult one, I know, but if there is that potential for redundancy, have that conversation, start the communication. From my experience of the cold face of it all.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like I was saying previously, I think communication is key. And you're quite right about keeping people on furlough for a long period of time, because in some cases it could be postponing the inevitable. And you've got to think about de-skilling of the employee. Not only will it not be helping your business necessarily, it won't be helping them. So the kindest way forward might be to go through that redundancy sooner rather than later, particularly if you don't think the situation is going to change. Just do it. mean, in terms of voluntary redundancies as well, if you've got groups of people and it is genuinely about reduction of headcount in certain areas, that might be a way to accomplish what you need. And you can go through it in terms of communicating directly and possibly offering a little bit more for people to leave voluntarily, get things done on settlement agreements. And also, if you're not going to do that or consider outplacement, because outplacement support's really important, I think, for you to consider as an employer, because that's a way to add value back in terms of thinking about losing staff, but thinking about what they will then do in the future. If you can help them get a position elsewhere, nobody leaves necessarily with that bad taste in their mouth, and outplacement is a cost-effective way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's something I get, we're sort of in communication and discussing collaboration about, is talking about the online course that I've created that can take staff through, if they're being made redundant, a programme of understanding and self-discovery about, what it is that they want to do, where they can go. And so we're in discussions about that, because it can be quite enlightening and it can help them and add value as part of the redundancy process. But that's another conversation altogether. But it sort of weaves into that, adding value to that redundancy package, that severance, however big or small you are. It's how you have that communication, how you end that employment, and how you send somebody on the way with, with a smile rather than a grimace.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your valuable insight. And there's lots of valuable top tips in there for employers and employees, really, to to take note of and to listen to. And obviously they can get in touch with you directly if they want more information, of course, which I'll pop into the comments at the bottom of the video on YouTube. But how can people get in touch with you generally if they just want to hear it from your very lips, Roscoe?
Yeah, absolutely. They can give me a call, or they can go onto the website. And for employers as well, there's some guides on how to handle redundancy fairly, both from a collective perspective and an individual perspective. Collective meaning 20 or more. But that can be a useful starting point if you're at the beginning of the process and need to understand what to do and when, and then to seek advice as when you need it. What I would say is take advice sooner rather than later, because it's easier to deal with something from the beginning. Prevention is better than cure. Sounds trite, but it's true.
No, it is very true. And like we were just saying about making that decision with staff on furlough, delaying the inevitable, crack on, make a decision, do it, allow somebody to move on with their life if that role isn't going to be there. I mean, that decision's got to be made, and it's not easy times for everybody. I'm not sort of disputing that, but it's about enabling somebody to move forward with their life with a smile, not a grimace.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much again. I really, really appreciate your time. It's great. I value it. Thank you, Roscoe.